Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Inshallah, today we shall continue our conversation about the protist. As a review, you recall we divided the universe of the living things as we understand them into 6 kingdoms. The new classification includes domains, and a domain is dedicated to the archaebacteria. That's like the first domain, domain archaea, archaebacteria. And then there's a whole domain dedicated to the eubacteria, or simply domain bacteria. And the third domain is actually all the eukaryotes, which includes everything you're going to talk about in the future. So, domain archaebacteria, domain eubacteria, and the domain eukaryotes. And all the prokaryotes, of course, are the bacterial kingdoms. Now, Kingdom Protista is what we are currently the subject of our discussion. And if you recall, we had divided the Protist kingdom into 3 different categories. Even this is evolving, and by the time you get to teach biology, this probably will have already changed. Classification I kind of like, actually, is this one, where the protists are broadly categorized into 3 different types. Specifically, animal-like protist, plant-like protist, and the fungus-like protist. We've talked about animal-like protists before. These are protists that basically eat other things, and they're motile. And this included the amoebas, the flagellates, and the ciliates, and the sporozoans, the plasmodium, malaria, and falciparum that we talked about last time. Today we shall talk about plant-like protist, and also finally a fungus-like protist, which will complete our discussion of the protist. The characteristics of plant-like protists, as you can imagine, is that they are photosynthetic. That's their defining characteristics, but they have many features that are very much unlike plants, so therefore they're categorized in a separate category. The evolutionary origin of present-day plants, in fact, is thought to be related to photosynthetic protists. The fungus-like protists, as you can imagine, have some characteristic of fungi, and the characteristic of fungi is that they produce spores and they eat dead material. They are heterotrophs. So let's begin then with our conversation for today, and that is the plant-like protist. There are 4 specific types that we're going to talk about. The first, the euglenoids, diatoms, and the DINOFLAGELLATES, and the red, brown, green algae. So the red, brown, green algae. So let's talk about the euglenoids first. Euglenoids are fascinating creatures. They actually have 2 flagella at this end, and they have this peculiar movement, and which is like flask-like shape, kind of almost like peristaltic type movements. These are creatures. They are unicellular eukaryotic living things, and as you can see, even without any staining, they are green because of the abundant chloroplast that they have, and therefore they are photosynthetic. So they have a flagellum. They actually have 1 or 2 flagellum, a smaller flagellum that's not depicted in this particular cartoon picture. They have something called an eye spot, and that's like a little pigmented area which is able to spot where the light is coming from. It's a little light antenna. It's light sensitive. So, and that's good because you want Euglena, it wants to move towards light because it has chloroplast. So here's a living thing that's like plants, because it does photosynthesis, but it's mobile and motile like plants typically are not, and also it's of course unicellular. So here's some chloroplast. It has this contractile vacuole, the sump pump of the cell, which protects the cell from swelling up and dying. And most of these protists are freshwater living things. Euglena certainly is, and that's the nucleus. This is a more detailed drawing of the euglena, and here's a flagellum over here, and this is the eye spot or the stigma of the bug. This is a contractile vacuole, not to be confused with the central vacuole, as I have been reminded. And this is the contractile vacuole, the sump pump, so to speak, of the euglena. And as you can see, it's a beautifully eukaryotic organism with all the characteristic of eukaryotic cells, including endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, mitochondria, and abundant chloroplast, although they typically don't look like the plant chloroplast that you have seen before in your studies. That's the nucleus and the nucleolus, and stored carbohydrates. Now, the interesting thing about this, and this presumably is the eye spot, the interesting thing about this euglena is that it is a photosynthetic organism, and therefore it's a plant-like protist. However, it's also able to ingest small microorganisms if there's no light around. So in conditions that are not favorable to photosynthesis, they become heterotrophs. So they are both autotrophic and heterotrophic depending on the circumstances. That's euglena. They lack a cell wall. They have chloroplast. When the light is not available, they can ingest nutrients and ingest other small microorganisms. They're both autotrophs and heterotrophs. Now, euglenas divide by asexual reproduction. In other words, they divide by like binary fission. That is, they make clones of themselves. And if you recall, the difference between sexual and asexual reproduction is that in sexual reproduction there is generation of genetic variability, and as a result of combination and permutations of the genetic material between two different cells. Now, however, euglenas divide here by basically what's called cleavage process, and then they duplicate the nuclei, and then they split into two. And here's a euglena that's like in the process of splitting into two. So those are the euglenoids in the first category of the plant-like protists. And the plant-like protists are sometimes also called algae. Algae. Best if you just drop this A, it's easier to pronounce. Plant-like protists or algae. So that's the first category of plant-like protist. Now, as you can imagine, all of these are going to be photosynthetic protist, and that's their defining feature. The next category is this beautiful category, or the diatoms. Diatoms are unicellular, right, photosynthetic organisms, and they have a shell, a protective shell, which is actually pretty strong apparently. Like the shell of a diatom is one of the strongest things, and it's apparently able to hold the weight of, like, if you would put an elephant on a table and eat the weight of exerted by each leg of the table. That's how much weight these things are able to withhold. Anyway, these are very, very sturdy silica shells. And they produce most of, at least 50% of the Earth's oxygen, and they're part of the phytoplankton. Phytoplankton, the floating, so photosynthetic limit, is a broad association of groups of things. So when we say plankton, it's different microorganisms, including diatoms, including photosynthetic bacteria and other living creatures. So phytoplankton, or plankton that's found in the surface of the oceans, is a very eclectic collection of groups of living things, but diatoms comprise a good part of it. And we will see the phytoplankton is a good deal of it is diatoms, but a good deal of it is also DINOFLAGELLATEs and red, brown, and green algae. So these are all constituents of the phytoplankton, and including the photosynthetic bacteria, and they float in the surface of the oceans, and they're the primary producers in the ocean. In other words, they generate energy, and they're eaten by, they're tiny little things, right? All these things are microscopic things, but then they're microscopic living organisms that feed on these things, and then there are bigger organisms that feed on those small organisms, then they're bigger organisms, and then in the end, you end up in the stomach of a whale. So it's kind of like that. But there's tons and tons and tons and tons of these phytoplankton constituents. Another aspect of these diatoms is that they have amazing diversity in regards to their the beautiful geometric shapes, and I find these amazingly beautiful and creatures. These are scanning electron micrographs, that of this. Now, the other thing about this silica shell is that, and when they die, they leave behind inside of that's their protective shell. Inside of them is like a living eukaryotic thing, which has chloroplast type stuff in there. Now, chloroplast is green because of the particular chlorophyll pigment that it has. Chlorophyll is not the only pigment that's able to capture light, right? Because you can see there are carotenoids, for example, are another example of a light capturing pigment that you can find. So there are other pigments, chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, carotenoids, etc., that give different shades of colors to different things that are able to do photosynthesis. So some of them have red pigment. That's why red algae is red algae, green algae, brown algae, and diatoms are the various different colors. So the color a thing has, a photosynthetic thing, it depends on what pigment it carries. Chlorophyll is a common pigment that we are familiar with that's in plants, but it's not certainly, even in plants, it's not the only light capturing pigment. And each pigment has a specific range of wavelength of light that it captures. That's why the different living things like to have a different set of pigments, half pigment will travel type of approach. So, but anyway, so they have different pigments and giving them different colors, all of these living things. Now, the silica shell are very sturdy and things, and then they have a little shiny color, and they're used for paint, the type of paint that you use for painting cars and trucks and things, for example. And phytoplankton, they are very abundant, and they produce a lot of oxygen. Also therefore trap carbon dioxide. So when they die, in fact, their shells accumulate at the ocean floor, and as I said, it's used in metal polishes and paint to make it like sparkly type of appearance to the paint. Now here's the various diatoms. They reproduce by asexual reproduction, and they also can reproduce by sexual reproduction, as we shall see. Like in this particular example, this particular diatom, see, it has it's like a shoebox type of a structure. And the box with the lid, the lid opens, and it kind of, so to speak, and then first the nuclei divide. So this is asexual reproduction. The nuclei divide by mitosis, and you have two identical nuclei, and then you open the lid, and here's the rest of the box. So one nuclei in each part of the of this subset of cell, and then it complements itself with the lid or the box on the other side. So this is kind of funky way of asexual reproduction. Now, this is asexual reproduction, that is, there's no exchange of genetic material, and the daughters that are produced are both identical. Sometimes though, they can also do asexual reproduction, and that's demonstrated over here. In asexual reproduction, what can happen is, for example, two separate diatoms over here, they can, instead of dividing by mitosis like they do over here, they divide by, this is a diploid cell, right? They divide by meiosis to give 4 haploid cells, because remember, meiosis takes diploid cells, and there are 2 divisions that occur, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, and the end result are 4 haploid daughter cells, which are all distinct from each other. So then they each do that. So one of them divides like this, and the other one also goes to meiosis, and lo and behold, it produces little gametes with motile sperm type things, and then they open up, the shoebox type box opens up, and then here we go, and then the sperm goes to the egg, and they've produced, the gametes meet, and they fuse together and make it again a diploid zygote. And gametes are, of course, haploid. Now here there's genetic variability that's occurring over here, right? because these are not, they could be different diatoms, and they combine together to give a different, entirely different diatom, genetically speaking. So, and then also remember, even in the process of meiosis, because of the how the chromosomes are aligned, generates variability. So, the sexual and asexual reproduction can occur in these species. Tiny little diatoms, who thought that they were so complicated, right? So here they are. So we talked about plant-like protists, the euglenoids, plant-like protists in general. You can refer to them as algae, but there's specific algae here that we talk about in a second. So euglenoids we talked about, the diatoms we talked about, and now we shall talk about the DINOFLAGELLATES, or the spinning algae. These are fascinating creatures. They look like little tiny, space invaders in a sense. DINOFLAGELLATEs, they are the spinning algae. They also have a cell wall apparently that's made up of cellulose, not the same as the diatoms, which have the silica cell wall. Silica shell. These are cellulose shell, and they have chlorophyll, and they also have a red pigment. And DINOFLAGELLATES, they have in their rim over here, the waist, so to speak, they have two flagella. That's why it's dino, like two flagella in the rim here, kind of like this. Okay, and they spin. That's how they move to capture nutrients around, etc. Oh, here they are. So they also come in various different shapes, and all pretty much very small. And they're also part of the phytoplankton. As I said, phytoplankton is a plethora of different types of living things. It's not one thing that constitutes the phytoplankton. The little tiny microorganisms in the surface of the ocean that do photosynthesis. They include the cyanobacteria, which are very important, and the diatoms, and the DINOFLAGELLATES we talked about, and the green algae, which we will talk about in just a little bit, and this is an interesting coccoliophore, which we'll talk about inshallah in the future as well. So anyway, so among the phytoplankton are these DINOFLAGELLATES, and they are very important producers of oxygen on the planet. There are also these little diatoms are responsible for the red tide because they have a red pigment. Now this particular river is not red because of the photographic effects or something like that. It's red because this is a diatom bloom. It's called a red tide. So in other words, they just kind of like go crazy, divide, because they just have lots of nutrition around. So they have so many diatoms over here that actually change the color of the of the river. The thing about them is that once they die, they have a particular neurotoxin. So initially, when there's lots of diatoms, as I said, there are other living things that feed on them, and as the higher up you go on the food chain, the more toxin that accumulates, right? So because a little bug will eat a bunch of these diatoms, it will accumulate some of that toxin, the neurotoxin, and then a whole bunch of these little bugs are eaten by a bigger bug, and then bigger fish, and then the toxin get more and more concentrated. So in red tides, in fact, can be bad news for the fishes because they accumulate poisons, and lots of fishes can die. And in fact, harvesting of shellfish, for example, is banned or not allowed during red tides because the shellfish because they eventually they're high in their hierarchy of pyramid. Feeding pyramid, they accumulate this toxin. They had eaten these diatoms. So so don't do that. In fact, I had seen a patient like this with the shellfish poisoning with the neurotoxin, and that can be sometimes permanent. damaged the nerve. So pain from neuropathy, etc. So those are dinoflagellates. And finally, the last category of the plant-like protists, we talked about the euglenoids and diatoms, the beautiful diatoms, the dinoflagellates with the 2 flagella, and finally the proper red, brown, green algae. Now, before we embark on this topic, I just want to, I think I have a slide on that, but I just want to clarify something. There is something called green algae, blue-green algae. So I see there's a blue-green algae, which is an old name. Pardon me. Do have. So there's a blue-green algae, which is a cyanobacterium. So there's a cyanobacteria, which are photosynthetic bacteria, also known as blue-green algae. Because they were classified in this because they do photosynthesis, so they're part of this, but they're no longer classified, but this name persists. So blue-green algae actually are not algae, but they're cyanobacteria. That's important too because they're toxic as well. So the blue-green algae is not the same as the green algae that's spoken over here. This is one word, green algae. It's not blue-green algae. So the cyanobacteria is in fact a bacterium, the blue-green algae. In fact, the way these have evolved, these are all eukaryotic cells. These are all eukaryotic. So the way they have evolved is that the thought is that they ate up a cyanobacteria. And then they took the cyanobacteria up, and this is a symbiosis. And these cyanobacteria eventually evolved into the chloroplast. Indeed, this is a symbiotic theory, endosymbiotic theory, if you remember, endosymbiosis. So these evolved by their chloroplast. In fact, chloroplasts that are in here, photosynthetic organelle, or plastids they're called in general, and chloroplast is chlorophyll related photosynthetic organelle, but you can imagine there are other pigment related. So in general they're called plastids, all these photosynthetic organelles. So it's thought that there's some progenitor of these ancient ancestor of these protists one day just kind of engulfed one of these cyanobacteria, and that eventually say, hey, this guy makes his own energy, so let's just keep him as a pet type of thing. So it evolved into like a little chloroplast. That's how they thought to have evolved. So anyway, back to our red, brown, and green algae. There's great variety and variation in this category of protist, and they kind of look like plants, right? Yeah, but they're not plants, of course. But so here's a red algae and the brown algae and the green algae. Now, the red algae, even among red algae, there's a profound variation, and the brown algae and green algae, there's lots of variation. And the scum that you typically see in the ponds in the summertime is actually green algae most of the time. Here's a brown algae. Brown algae, it can look like a little plant over here. It has a little like root-like system. It's not roots, because you'll see when we study plant roots, you'll see, wow, they're complicated structures. For roots, they're actually very complicated at cellular level and tissue level, and these are nowhere nearly as complicated at the microscopic or tissue level and then plant roots are. But anyway, it has a root-like structure called holdfast, which kind of anchors this brown algae to whatever it wants to anchor on. It has a stem type thing called stipe, and it has this thing called floats, which we'll talk about in a second, and leaves, which are called blades. So it has a holdfast and stipe and these blades, and the blades are kind of the leaves of this thing. And the float here is kind of like is an area or sometimes called the bladder of the plant, where it has lots of air-filled sacs in it, which allows these things to float, and they can be like, apparently as big as the size of half of a football field, like 50 yards or something like that tall. And so these brown algae can go very, very, very tall, and they kind of these float structures allow them to kind of float, and they kind of in the plant, and so they're anchored in the ground of the body of water, and then but the plant floats because there's no light at the bottom of the water. There's light at the top of the water, and these are specialized areas of this plant or algae that allow them to float, and that's because it's filled with water. They're also in the cells and area of these. They're specialized there where it can have more airy areas, allowing it to also float. So here's an example. Here's the holdfast there, right? It's not like roots, right? You imagine plant like hanging on like this. It's not exactly right. It's holding on for sure, right? So that's an example. And they're popular in aquariums, because they're pretty in a sense, right? Now the green algae also, there's tremendous variety among these, and they can be unicellular, or they can form colonies or multicellular. So they can it could be unicellular, or they can form a colony, or they can be multicellular. Okay, so what's the difference? See, in a colony, every cell is kind of like independent. Okay. And in a multicellular thing, every cell can be independent too, but there is some degree of specialization. In other words, for example, a heart cell by itself your heart cell, my heart cell, can't live by itself. But in a colony, the cells that make up the colony, they're pretty independent. So here's an example of a green algae, the Volvox, and each one of this is a tiny cell, all right? And that's over here, okay, and they have two little tiny flagella. They have their own nuclei and stuff, but they're organized. They're kind of like, they tied a rope around their waist, so to speak, like this, and their cytoplasmic extensions like this. They tied themselves each other into this big ball, and there's some gelatinous material they secrete to keep them together like this. So they're kind of like buddied up, see? But each of them is independent, other than the fact that they're kind of, together, hooked up like this. They're not much interacting with each other. The function of one of these is not affecting the function of another one, so to speak. But there is some specialization. There are two different types of cells in here. One is majority of the cells are just plain old cells, and some of these are gamete cells, which can actually give rise to daughter colonies like you see over here. So because of this specialization, Volvox, some people classify as colony, but others, because of this specialization, they call it multicellular algae. So either way, that's what it is. So you can see each of this individual cell, and the inside of it is not just nothing. There's a gelatinous material in here, and then there's gelatinous material in between these cells, kind of gluing them together. And there's reproductive cells and give rise to these little tiny colonies, which can then go on to, when these break, see, these can exit here and form new colonies. Okay. They're photosynthetic, as you can see. They got nice juicy chloroplasts. They have a little tiny eye spot too. Now algae kind of gets a bad rap, but they're actually very useful. So for example, some of them they're edible. You can eat them, and apparently, although I don't like to eat not just sushi, there's something about sushi that just doesn't agree. So anyway, then they're used for many other things. They're used for ingredients for in many foods. Sometimes they're used in Jello. Apparently, because they give it the Jello structure. They're used for some medicinal purposes, etc. So they have a bunch of uses. They're not like all useless to us. In fact, they're quite useful. So that's the red, brown, green algae. So that's the plant-like protist. The final category among the kingdom Protista that we shall explore are the fungus-like protists, and these are kind of fascinating things. These include the slime molds and the water molds and downy mildews, which they can like infect and eat up plants. You probably see these too in the spring and summertime. But we shall focus our attention only on the slime molds because they're kind of like freaky cute in a way. So slime molds. So these are fungus-like protists, okay? And the two of them are in the slime mold category. There's a plasmodial mold and the cellular mold. Now, don't confuse this plasmodial mold with the Plasmodium malariae, which is the different protozoan, Plasmodium falciparum, Plasmodium malariae, Plasmodium vivax, all those things. Those are they have the same first name, but their last name is different, so to speak. You know what I'm saying? So they are different things. These are different species. So there are two types of slime molds. There's a plasmodial slime mold and a cellular slime mold, and we shall look at these. Now, the plasmodial slime mold is the dogworm, which we talked about before. And so they're fungus-like. So what is it fungusy about them, you say? Well, here's the fungus part of it. See, what fungus do is they make spores. So fungus-like because they make what's called fruiting bodies. See, these are fruiting bodies right here. These are both fungi. So they make fruiting bodies. These molds do, that is, which make spores. So the way we will see is, when we study fungi is they make spores. They make spores by the millions, and this is a little water droplet in this tiny fungus, and as the water droplet hits, it's squirting the spores, and that helps in the dispersion of the spores. So that's pretty much this, and the fact that they eat other things. They are decomposers as well. Fungi are decomposers, and so are these molds. They're cleanup crew of the jungle, so to speak. That's where the similarity ends. Otherwise, structurally at a microscopic level, they are very, very different. There's spores over here too from these fungi. Now, here's plasmodial slime. This is the dogworm, and if you look for them, you will find them. They're typically found in moist areas, in the spring, summertime, and they look like this. But they look static, but you have to come back a little while later, then you see it's not actually static, the thing moves. So to understand this, I'm going to take you through a life cycle of a plasmodial slime mold, okay? Now this is a complicated picture. It's not really that complicated once we're done with it. So what happens is, so each plasmodial slime mold, each individually starts out like a little tiny amoeba. Exactly like an amoeba, like we've seen before. It has a pseudopods and everything like that. So here's a whole bunch of plasmodial slime amoebas go about, and then when it's wet conditions and stuff, there's a lot for them to eat. What do they eat? They eat bacteria, they eat dead stuff, they eat small microorganisms and things. So they're like amoeba. Remember the amoeba eating the paramecium, just like that. So they're going hunting for these things and anything that they can, but they realize that they actually can be better predators if they come together. So what they do is like hundreds and millions of these tiny amoebas, which are microscopic. They come together and form this blob of stuff. So here's the zygote, and they divide by mitosis to give a bunch of amoebas. So imagine like hundreds of these amoebas, and then they come together into what's called a feeding plasmodium giant cell. Now this is a pretty remarkable thing. Okay, so what you see over here, okay, what you see over here is one big giant cell. It's got a whole bunch of cell nuclei, but it does not have any cell membranes in it. It's like they all come together, they dissolve their cell their membranes, and it's like a one giant cell. So if you ever seen a one giant cell, if you ever want to see one giant cell, you can see it's naked, you gotta find these plasmodial slime mold, and that itself is a very fascinating thing, right? So it's one big giant cell with a whole bunch of nuclei in it, and then what happens then, and it even grows. In other words, in the size of if you have one that's the size of a silver dollar, can become the size of a $2 silver by dividing the nuclei but not making cell membranes that surround it. So that way it can just keep growing and growing and growing and feeding on other things. So it goes around and feeds like this So a whole bunch of these plasmodial amoeba come together to make a giant plasmodium cell. Okay, one cell. And then it keeps going and going and just eating this and lives out its life like this. But then when the season dries up, because it has to be around wet stuff to move around and eat, it's that things, there's no more food available and it can't grow and feed itself. It starts to die. But when it starts to die, that's when it begins to make spores. See, then it prepares to make the fruiting body. That's called a fruiting body. Okay, like a fruit. So it prepares the fruit, and some of the cells they specialize. Some of these cells they specialize. Okay, and they make these sporangium. And then now, mind you, these are all diploid nuclei. The nuclei don't fuse. It's like a giant cell with the hundreds and thousands and millions of nuclei. Okay, the nuclei don't fuse. But here they make little sporangium. Okay, and then they make tiny little cells over here. Okay, and they divide by meiosis. See, each of the nuclei here is a diploid nuclei. Each of those nuclei is a diploid nuclei. Okay, it has a nuclear envelope. It's one by itself type thing. Okay, but when you come over here, when these sporangium, the mature sporangium, they divide by meiosis to give haploid spores. So these are start out as two nuclei and they give haploid spores. So these are haploid spores, and these haploid spores then they germinate like fungi do. Remember that picture of fungi germinating spores, and they germinate, and then when they come out of here, okay, they're male and female spores, believe it or not, and some of them are flagellated like sperms are, and some of them are amoeboid cells. So they make two types of spores, the flagellated spores and the amoeboid spores, and they come together. See, that's what sexual reproduction, and they fertilize to give the zygote. So this is the life cycle of the Plasmodium slime. Okay, now this is a cool picture. So here's an example of a Plasmodial slime mold. These are time-lapse photography, and so if you were to take pictures of this area, every I don't know, a few minutes, then they can gather them together. This is how it would look, or you take a movie and run it fast forward. Now what you see curiously here is that the whole yellow thing, that's the mold, the Plasmodial slime mold, a big unicellular, multinucleated, gigantic cell, basically creeping along the vegetable matter or for dying debris, organic debris, or whatever it wants to eat, fungi or whatnot. So and then you see these veins. Those veins are kind of like highways for this organism, and then wherever it finds foods, it kind of brings it along with the rest of the cytoplasm and nuclei, the rest of the organism in the area, and has little feelers, little tiny things out just to see if there's food around. And if there's food around, then those veins, those highways, are going to enlarge and become the main channels of forward movement, so to speak. So this is a Plasmodial slime. When it's done feeding, and if there's no food around left, or if the conditions are not optimal for survival, that is, if it's a dry environment, etc., it begins to die, and then it forms these fruiting bodies, or spore formation occurs in these little bodies over here. It's kind of like this, and the spores then would disperse and start a new generation of amoebic slime molds here. So, and there's some cool videos about this if you want to ever Google Plasmodial slime mold videos. They're fascinating. That's the Plasmodial slime mold. There are two types of slime molds, as I suggested, that we should briefly acquaint ourselves. That's the one we discussed, is the Plasmodial slime mold. The other one is a cellular slime mold. The only difference being, or the primary difference being, that in this case, the cellular slime mold, the aggregate amoebas, they retain their cell membrane. So when they form like this, they form a big giant blob of cells that move cohesively as one, and migratory colony, just like the Plasmodial slime mold. And then they also form fruiting bodies, just like the Plasmodium slime mold. In that sense, they are very, very similar. So here's some pictures of the Plasmodial slime. You see the thing moves over there, and these are the fruiting body formation from this particular organism. And then there are water molds and downy mildews that affect plants like you see over here, and you can read more about them in your textbook if you wanted to. But this concludes our survey of the wide array of the cornucopia of organisms that constitute the kingdom Protista, the eukaryotic kingdom of fascinating living things. Until next time, as-salatu was-salamu ala rasulillah walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum.